You can picture the scene. Early morning, a tomb, stone rolled away, angels, and the announcement that Jesus is risen. And standing right there at the edge of the greatest news in history are women. Mary Magdalene, and depending on the gospel, other women with her. Mary, the mother of James, Salome, Joanna, and others. Most Christians know that part of the story. They know, at least in the broad outline, that women were the first ones at the tomb. But because that detail is so familiar, many people stop noticing how strange it is and how important it is. Because women at the tomb are not just a sweet detail in the Easter story. They're not there merely to add emotional texture. They're not background characters in the drama of resurrection. They are one of the sharpest signs that the story the Gospels are telling is not what anyone would have scripted. And they are one of the clearest revelations of how the kingdom of God overturns the world's instincts about power, credibility, faithfulness, and witness. That is what people tend to miss. Because when modern readers hear the women were first at the tomb, it could sound normal enough, maybe even expected. But in the first century world, that detail lands very differently. And once you feel that, the whole resurrection narrative starts to deepen exponentially. The first thing to notice is this: the women do not come to the tomb expecting resurrection. That matters. A lot of people, especially skeptics, talk as if the resurrection accounts were written by people so desperate to believe that they turned grief into fantasy. But that is not how the story is told. The women come to the tomb with spices. In other words, they come expecting a corpse. That's important. They're not coming to celebrate. They're not coming in secret hope that maybe Jesus beat death overnight. They're not arriving with resurrection theology fully formed in their minds. They're coming to care for a dead body. That's one of the strongest details in the whole scene because it tells you the women are not presented as people primed for wishful thinking. They're presented as people walking straight into the finality of death. The Sabbath has ended. The shock of the crucifixion is still raw. And now they come to do the last loving thing that they know how to do. That's where Easter morning begins. Not in triumph, but with grief. And that matters because it tells you something about the resurrection itself. The resurrection does not happen in a community full of confident expectation and spiritual momentum. It breaks into a community of confusion, sorrow, fear, and shattered hope. That's the first thing that people miss. The women at the tomb are not there because they're expecting a miracle. They're there because they're faithful in grief. And that already makes them remarkable. Because think about the contrast the Gospels have been building. When Jesus is arrested, many of the male disciples flee. Jesus denies him. The inner circle fractures under pressure, but the women remain faithful. They're present at the crucifixion. They see where he's buried, and then they return to the tomb. That pattern matters because the women are not in the resurrection story by accident. They have stayed close to Jesus all the way through the darkness. That's one of the deepest things the Gospels are quietly showing you. When the movement collapses in public, when the Messiah appears defeated, when the male disciples scatter in fear, these women remain enough to witness the end, and therefore near enough to witness the beginning. That's not sentimentality, that's theology. The first resurrection witnesses are the ones who stayed near to the cross. That alone should stop us. Because the Gospels are not telling you who happened to get there first. They're telling you something about discipleship, something about love that stays, something about devotion that does not disappear when hope looks buried, something about a kind of faithfulness that survives the silence between Friday and Sunday. That's the first layer. Then comes the second. In the first century, women were not generally treated as the strongest public witnesses in legal or formal settings. That's simply part of the historical landscape. of the world the Gospels were written in. Which means if you were inventing a resurrection story for maximum cultural credibility in that environment, this is probably not how you would script it. You would put Peter there first, or maybe John, or at least a group of prominent male disciples whose testimony would land with immediate public weight. But that's not what the Gospels do. All four accounts, in different ways, place women at the tomb first. Now, that doesn't prove the resurrection all by itself, of course, but it does tell you something important about the shape of the tradition. The evangelists are not smoothing the story into what would have been more advantageous according to cultural expectation. They're reporting a story whose contours they did not feel free to erase, even though those contours cut against worldly instincts about whose testimony counts most. That is significant because it gives the whole resurrection narrative an unscripted quality. The women were there because the women were there. And that turns out to matter even more theologically than it does historically, because the kingdom of God has always had a way of putting the weightiest truths in the hands of people the world is least likely to center. That is part of the pattern of the Gospels. Jesus keeps moving toward those on the margins. Jesus keeps honoring the ones others overlook. He keeps receiving the ones religious and cultural systems underestimate. And now, at the center of the Christian claim, at the hinge of history itself, who gets the first commission to go and tell? The women do. That's not an incidental flourish. That is resurrection logic. The kingdom arrives in a way the world would not have chosen. And once you see that, the women at the tomb are not just first to find out, they're the first entrusted messengers of the risen Christ. And that matters immensely, especially because in some of the accounts, the women not only see the empty tomb, they receive the angelic announcement and are then sent with a message to the disciples. In other words, they become the first human heralds of Easter, the first preachers of the resurrection in the most basic sense. That's extraordinary because it means the first Easter sermon in the world is carried not by the apostles, but to the apostles. And that reveals one of the great reversals in the Gospels. The men who will later stand publicly in Acts to proclaim the risen Christ first hear that news from women on a road out of a graveyard. That is one of the things that people miss. The resurrection does not begin with polished authority, it begins with startled witness. Grieving women come to a tomb expecting death, and instead they are sent out carrying the most world altering message ever given to human lips. He is not here, he has risen. Then there's the other detail that people often glide past. The women are not instantly triumphant. In Mark, especially, the first reaction is fear, trembling, astonishment. In other accounts, there's joy too, but even there, the joy is mixed with confusion and awe and the kind of holy disruption that happens when the categories of the world break open in front of you. That matters because it keeps the story from becoming flat. That is not the emotional tone of people who are calmly acting out a theological script. That is the emotional tone of people being overtaken by a reality too large for them. The empty tomb does not make them immediately sleek and composed, it undoes them first. And that's often how resurrection works in the Gospels. Before it comforts, it interrupts, it disrupts. Before it settles into doctrine, it breaks open the world people thought they understood. That's why the women at the tomb matter so much. They are not there to decorate the scene with piety. They embody the human response to resurrection before it becomes tidy. Grief, astonishment, fear, confusion, joy, commission, all of it at once. Then there's Mary Magdalene. And here the story gets even more personal. Because in John's Gospel, Mary remains outside the tomb weeping. She sees Jesus, and does not recognize him at first. She thinks he's the gardener. That detail is one of the most beautiful in all of the resurrection narratives because it tells you something profound about both grief and new creation. Grief can stand right in front of hope and not yet see it. Mary is not cold, not unbelieving in some shallow sense. She's shattered. She's looking through tears. And the risen Christ is so unexpected, so beyond the categories of loss that at first she cannot recognize him. Then Jesus says one single word, Mary, and everything changes. That is one of the deepest moments in the Easter story. The resurrection becomes personal in the speaking of a name. Not first a concept, not first a doctrine statement, a name spoken by the risen Lord. That is what opens her eyes. And when it does, she becomes the one sent to tell the disciples, I have seen the Lord. That matters because now the women are not merely witnesses at the empty tomb, they are witnesses to the risen Christ himself. And in Mary's case, the whole thing happens in a garden. That's not random either. John's a careful writer. The story of human death and exile began in a garden, and now the story of resurrection breaks open in a garden. Mary mistakes Jesus for the gardener, which on one level is a misrecognition, and yet another level, it's almost truer than she knows. Because the risen Christ is the beginning of a new creation. He is, in a sense, the true gardener of a renewed world. That's another thing that people miss. The women at the tomb are not only part of an evidence scene, they are part of a creation scene. The first day of the week, a garden, tears turning to recognition, death undone, a new world beginning. That is the deepest Easter language. Then there's the contrast between memory and revelation. In Luke's account, the women are reminded of Jesus' own words. Remember how he told you. That matters because the resurrection is not merely a shocking interruption, it's also the fulfillment of what Jesus had been saying all along. But notice who first receives that reminder: the women. They become the first ones to hold together what seems impossible. The cross was real, the tomb was real, and yet Jesus' words are truer than death. That makes them the first interpreters of Easter in a very real sense. The first to begin seeing that the story did not collapse on Friday. It moved through Friday into Sunday. And then, of course, they go and tell the others, and the response they receive is painful but revealing. In Luke, the apostles hear the women's report and think it sounds like nonsense. That matters because it shows you that the resurrection is not easy to believe, even for those closest to Jesus. Again, the story is not told as though the disciples were all poised and ready. They are resistant, slow, uncomprehending. The women tell them and still struggle to take it in. That detail strengthens the whole scene. The resurrection's not received because the first Christians were unusually gullible. It's received because something happened that shattered their grief and forced them, slowly and unevenly, into a new reality. And women are at the front edge of that. So, what do people miss about women at the tomb? They miss that women come expecting death, not resurrection. They miss that these are the same women who stayed near the cross when others fled. They miss how historically surprising it is that all four gospels put women first. They miss that the women are not just witnesses, but messengers. They miss that Mary's story in the garden turns the resurrection into something intensely personal and cosmically large at the same time. They miss that the whole scene reveals the kingdom of God Jesus has been building all along. A kingdom where the overlooked are entrusted with the greatest news. A kingdom where grief stricken faithfulness becomes the first place resurrection breaks in. A kingdom where the world's assumptions about power and credibility are overturned by the way God actually acts. Maybe the best way to say it is this: the women at the tomb are not there because they're the strongest public candidates. They are there because love brought them there, because faithfulness brought them there, because grief brought them there, and because God, in the deep logic of resurrection, chose that place of love and grief and faithfulness as the first human threshold of Easter. That's beautiful, and it's also deeply challenging because it means resurrection first arrives not to the powerful, not to the polished, not to the impressive, but to the ones who loved Jesus enough to come back while it was still dark. That line from John matters too, while it was still dark. That is not just about the sky, it's about the whole condition of the moment. The world is still dark. Their understanding is still dark. Grief is still dark. And into that darkness, the first witnesses come carrying burial spices and leave carrying resurrection news. That's the moment. That is what people miss. The women at the tomb are not a side note. They are one of the clearest signs that Easter does not begin where human expectation would place it. It begins in the dark, in grief, in a garden, with women who came to tend a body and instead became the first voices to announce that death had been broken. Maybe the best image is this: the world expects history to turn in throne rooms and courts and battlefields, with powerful men making decisive declarations. But Easter morning turns in a graveyard garden while grieving women stand blinking into the impossible. That's the gospel. That's the kind of kingdom Jesus brings. And that is why the women at the tomb matter so much. Because before the church had a sermon, before the apostles had clarity, before the world had categories for resurrection, there were women at a tomb hearing heaven say, He is not here, and then running into a world with the first impossible good news it had ever